Chapter 1, The Queen has a problem. The carriage was approaching the entrance to Brocket Hall, the private country residence of William Lamb, 2nd Viscount of Melbourne. Lord Melbourne was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and, in the context of the British parliamentary constitutional monarchy, he was the real ruler of the British Empire, the most powerful nation in the world at that time. Lord Melbourne ruled the country and its colonial empire from two offices, one located at Dover House, and another at its private residence in Brocket Hall. That day he was in Brocket Hall, about to be surprised by an unexpected visit. Inside the carriage was Leopold I, King of the Belgians, his official title as King of Belgium. Leopold was a German prince who had been married to the Princess Heiress of Crown of Great Britain, Princess Charlotte of Wales, but years after her death, in the birth of the only son of the couple, who also died, he had become King of Belgium, a new country that had been born of a revolution. In addition, he was uncle of the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, Queen Victoria, since Victoria's mother was Leopold's sister. Leopold's visit to Lord Melbourne was not only surprising because it had not been announced previously, but especially because the relationship between them was not exactly cordial but rather marked by tension and mutual mistrust. Leopold had seen Lord Melbourne as an obstacle in his effort for marrying his niece Victoria to his nephew Albert, son of Leopold's brother, Duke Ernest I of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, something very important for his political interests. And it is that Leopold was sure that Lord Melbourne was in love with his niece, and that she had been in love with him, until her feelings changed and she fell in love with Albert. But the victory that this meant for Leopold became a bitter defeat for the tragic events that followed, and that now led him to have a very difficult and unpleasant conversation with that adversary whom he believed to have defeated and to whom he now needed. While Leopold was approaching, Lord Melbourne was sitting behind his desk, in the library at Brocket Hall, having finished signing some decrees, which Queen Victoria later had to ratify with her signature, and keeping those and other official documents in his leather bag. He was getting ready to go to a meeting, and that was why he was in a hurry. However, when he took other documents, he again saw a newspaper that had been lying on his desk for a few days. He could not avoid taking the newspaper and reading once again the great front page headline, in big black typographic characters. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was murdered in his country, read Lord Melbourne, and then came a second headline in somewhat smaller letters, Queen Victoria's fiancé dies in an attack at the hands of a lone murderer. Lord Melbourne leaned back in his seat, and once more he felt a mixture of conflicting feelings. Of course he felt some sadness and compassion, after all a basically noble person like him could not help lamenting the death of such a young man in such a tragic and cruel way. In addition, he felt compassion for Victoria's pain, and he also felt a deep sadness when he saw her so devastated in their first meeting after the news was known. Even she cried in his arms, breaking the protocol. Anyone who knew the feelings of Lord Melbourne would know that he would do anything to keep her from suffering, that Victoria's pain was what most distressed him in his life. But on the other hand, Lord Melbourne felt guilty because he was aware that a part of him, of his mind and heart, had felt an evil joy. Because Albert's death prevented Victoria from marrying him. When Albert died, Lord Melbourne was deeply depressed and bitter, full of rage and even rancor against Albert and even against Victoria. Lord Melbourne could not help but detest the man who had stolen Victoria's love from forever, and he could not help but feel hurt because Victoria had changed her feelings so quickly, from loving him to love Albert and forget how important he had been in her life. So it was human that Lord Melbourne felt some satisfaction in the darkest part of his soul, but he tried to dispel those terrible and mean feelings, and he was deeply ashamed to feel them. And anyway, if Victoria could no longer marry Albert, sooner or later she would marry another European prince. It was her destiny, her inevitable destiny. A reigning Queen of Britain could only find a worthy husband among the men of European royalty. At least that was what dictated the most rancid tradition, which the traditionalists would argue for. If only he would have accepted his proposal. That was what most tormented Lord Melbourne, that Victoria had declared her love and proposed marriage to him before Albert. But he had rejected her, very gallantly and diplomatically, but he had rejected her. He had done it against his own feelings, because he loved her and nothing would have made him happier than marrying her. That is why he reproached God or destiny that Victoria had been born to be queen, because if it were not so he would have fought for her love. But he did not want to harm her, he did not want to jeopardize her permanence in the throne, he did not want her to be forced to abdicate for a disastrous political and constitutional crisis if she insisted on marrying him against the will of the country or at least of the ruling class. Nor did he want to endanger the stability of the country, for he was convinced that Britain needed Victoria as queen now more than ever. However, doubts sometimes assailed him and he thought that perhaps if they had fought together there would have been a good chance of getting approval for their marriage, if they had used a good strategy to convince public opinion and pressure the political class. But other times he dismissed it as a stupid hope of his broken heart. But in any case now it was about helping Victoria to endure the pain during the mourning stage, to make things easier, to protect her as he had always done. And the only good thing about that tragedy is that now he could have more time with her, before their paths separated forever. He tossed the newspaper aside, and stood up to fasten the straps of his purse where he carried the documents, and made a mental overhaul to make sure he did not forget anything before leaving. He was almost ready when the door opened and one of his servants, dressed in Brocket Hall's servant's livery, entered and announced ceremonially. "His Majesty, Leopold, King of the Belgians," said the servant. Lord Melbourne lifted his head with a gesture of great surprise on his face, wondering inside if he had heard wrong. But almost immediately Leopold entered the library, and the servant withdrew with a deep bowing and closed the door. "Lord Melbourne," Leopold said with deference, but with the arrogant stance with which he was addressing almost everyone, including Lord Melbourne. "Your Majesty," said Lord Melbourne, also with deference, trying to conceal the confusion he felt, "it is an honour to receive you at my house, though I must confess that it is an unexpected honour." "I know, Lord Melbourne. And I apologize for introducing myself at your home without first announcing my visit, and even without receiving an invitation. But an urgent matter brings me here." "I can ask you if you were about to leave," Leopold replied. "Well, I was actually about to leave for a meeting of leaders of my party, but if it is a very serious matter," replied Lord Melbourne, but deep down he was suspicious and feared what the Belgian king had come to tell, nothing good surely. "Yes, I would be grateful, Lord Melbourne. It would be very convenient to cancel or postpone your attendance at that meeting, because the matter is really urgent and cannot wait," said Leopold. "I understand," said Lord Melbourne, feeling rather nervous, though he dissembled it quite well, and then rang a bell for the servant waiting outside, who immediately opened the door. "Tell the butler to send a message to the meeting to which I was going to attend, he knows which, warning that I cannot attend for a very urgent state matter that has arisen at the last moment." The servant retired, and Lord Melbourne was again alone with King Leopold. "Majesty, have a seat, please," said Lord Melbourne. King Leopold sat down in an armchair, and then Lord Melbourne sat down in another armchair in front of him. "Lord Melbourne, you and I have never been very close, and I admit that it was more because of my attitude than yours. However, I recognize that you are an honourable man, a man who puts the duty above his own person, who loves his country and his queen, my niece. I know that your devotion to Victoria is sincere and disinterested, and that I say these words, it is very significant," said Leopold, politely and sincerely, but cold. "I am grateful, Your Majesty," replied Lord Melbourne, more and more uneasy, for he had the feeling that such flattery was like the siren song that attracted the sailors to death, for Leopold was perhaps the last man in the world to it would flatter him, unless something very powerful forced him to do so. "Lord Melbourne, the tragic death of my nephew," Leopold continued, and his voice cracked, and the cold mask on his face cracked, allowing for an instant the emotion to take possession of the usually cold, self-controlled man, evidencing real pain that he felt for the death of his favourite nephew, producing in Lord Melbourne a moment of discomfort, but then the Belgian king regained his aplomb. "It has provoked a very difficult situation, just when were removed all the obstacles for the marriage of my nephews, and your parliament was about to approve the arrangements for Albert's future status as Victoria's husband. But this tragedy has destroyed all plans and has left my niece in a very complex situation. I understand, Your Majesty, and believe me that I will do my best to help the Queen in this situation. Fortunately, the whole nation is united at this time to support their Queen, and sympathy is almost unanimous from the streets to Parliament, Lord Melbourne replied, trying to be reassuring. That pleases me, Lord Melbourne. But the situation is much more delicate than you think, Leopold said, and Lord Melbourne had the strange feeling that beneath his mask of apparent coldness, the Belgian monarch was also a little nervous, and what is worse, he seemed to be gathering strength to say what he was going to say next, and not knowing why Lord Melbourne's heart began to accelerate. Lord Melbourne, there is no easy and appropriate way to say this, so I will go straight to the point. My niece Victoria. She is pregnant, is waiting for a child of Albert. Lord Melbourne needed a moment to digest what he had heard, and when he did, it was like a heavy blow to his stomach, and a punch to the face. Spontaneously he rose from the armchair like a spring and turned his back on Leopold, and felt dizzy, so he planted his hand on the back of the armchair, trying to avoid the unworthiness of falling to the ground, collapsed before the Belgian king. Almost immediately he felt nauseous, and bit his other hand, trying to avoid with that gesture the urge to vomit. Fortunately the nausea disappeared, and then he pulled out a handkerchief to put it over his mouth and nose. His heart was beating like a runaway horse and his breathing was rattling. He had to close his eyes and concentrate to calm himself, and slow the rhythm of his heartbeat and his breathing. He felt sick, discomposed, as if suddenly his life would have ended and he would wait until him were thrown into the pit of his grave. Lord Melbourne, are you feeling well, or should I call your servants to find a doctor? Leopold asked with genuine consideration, after not speaking for a moment to give him his space to recover. No, it is not necessary, Your Majesty. Is this situation confirmed? Lord Melbourne asked, turning slowly and putting his handkerchief in his pocket as he did so. I'm afraid, yes, Lord Melbourne, for the Queen's doctor, who will, of course, keep absolute secrecy about the situation, Leopold replied uncomfortably and somewhat embarrassed. I see, said Lord Melbourne, displaying a very different face than he had before, as if he had grown from a healthy and energetic man, to a dying man. Lord Melbourne took a seat slowly and then fell silent, his eyes lowered, as if he had forgotten that in front of him he had a foreign head of state who was also the uncle of his own monarch. Lord Melbourne, I do not need to tell you that a queen cannot have a bastard child. That would be the end of Victoria's reign, her abdication would be the only acceptable solution to such a scandal, Leopold said, trying to concentrate on the problem, and thus obviate the shameful part. Of course, said Lord Melbourne, still in shock. When he heard Victoria's name, Lord Melbourne had the strange feeling that we're talking about someone missing, a loved one who had recently died and whose death burned his heart. Leopold realized that Lord Melbourne was not in a position to take the lead in that conversation, so he should be the one to take the lead in the dialogue. My sister and I have discussed with my niece the options. Naturally, one option would be to keep Victoria's pregnancy secret until birth, and then deliver the child to a loyal and discreet family who would take care of raising him as his own. That would have been a risky and very difficult, even though feasible, but the main problem was that Victoria flatly refused to even consider it. She does not want to give up her child, Albert's child, Leopold said coldly and expressionlessly on his face. The face of Lord Melbourne reflected pain and anger equally. Another option would be for Victoria to marry quickly with another prince of some reigning dynasty. Leopold continued. I see. I imagine you already have the candidate. Very well. You do not worry, under the circumstances I will do everything possible so that the marriage is approved, although I warn you that it will not be easy, said Lord Melbourne in a tone of sarcasm and a certain contempt poorly concealed. You're wrong, Lord Melbourne. Neither I have a candidate nor my niece accepted that idea, she stubbornly refuses to marry another prince unknown to her, answered Leopold angrily at the tone of Lord Melbourne, containing his indignation. I understand, then I fear there is little that can be done, Lord Melbourne replied angrily and with some nuisance. Lord Melbourne, I do not think I should remind you that if my niece Victoria is forced to abdicate, the new King of Great Britain would be the Duke of Cumberland, Leopold said, referring to Victoria's perverse, greedy paternal uncle, the next on the line of succession to the British throne. Believe me when I say to you, Your Majesty, that there is no one in England who least desires to see the despot King of Hanover in the throne of my country. For me that would be a catastrophe, but in these circumstances I see no way to avoid it, said Lord Melbourne with desperate impotence mingled with barely restrained rage, referring to the fact that Duke of Cumberland was at the same time King of the Germanic Kingdom of Hanover, in which had abolished the constitution and imposed its tyranny as absolute monarchy. It is not inevitable, there is another choice, Lord Melbourne, Leopold said. I hope you are not thinking about trying to interrupt the Queen's pregnancy, that would endanger her life, exclaimed Lord Melbourne, unable to avoid anguish. By whom you take me, Lord Melbourne? After seeing my beloved Charlotte and my child die in childbirth, you thinks I would endanger Victoria's life? Exclaimed Leopold indignantly. And I have buried a son and a daughter, and my daughter was newborn, so no one can teach me in that field, said Lord Melbourne furiously. They were silent for a moment. Sorry, Your Majesty. I apologize to you, Lord Melbourne said truthfully, but still tense. I also apologize, Lord Melbourne. I know this is not easy for you or for me, Leopold replied more serenely, but as I said, there is another option. What would that be, Your Majesty? Lord Melbourne asked, trying to act reasonably. The marriage, Lord Melbourne, answered Leopold. I thought you said Her Majesty did not want to get married, Lord Melbourne replied, trying to control his impatience and anger. No, Lord Melbourne. I said that my niece does not want to marry another prince of royal blood, especially one she does not know, but there is a man she would be willing to marry. With you, Lord Melbourne, said Leopold very seriously and with a certain air of tragic resignation. Lord Melbourne stood up again, his face stunned. You're making fun of me, Your Majesty, cried Lord Melbourne angrily. I would never make jokes with something so delicate, replied Leopold, angrily, and rose to his feet. That's folly, Lord Melbourne told him. Under normal circumstances it would be, but this situation is not normal. Let's talk clear, Lord Melbourne. My niece was in love with you before falling in love with her cousin, and I'm sure that if she fell in love with Albert it was only because she suffered a disappointment with you, and I'm sure that if you broke her heart it was for duty and not for inclination. Because I am also convinced that you are in love with my niece, Leopold replied firmly and earnestly. This conversation is absolutely out of place, Lord Melbourne protested indignantly and defensively. Come on, man. This is no time for squeamishness, or discreet silences. I watched them both, you and her. And you two did not deceive me, in fact, you two did not deceive many people. You were a couple in love. When I saw you two, I seemed to be seeing my poor Charlotte and myself more than 20 years ago. But Victoria was the queen and yours could not and should not be for the good of all. But now the circumstances have changed. The only possibility that Victoria has to save her honor and keep her crown, and that this country does not have a greedy despot of monarch, is that you make another sacrifice and marry her, the woman you love and the one you have sworn loyalty as queen, Leopold said briskly. But it's absurd. The country will not accept. Lord Melbourne defended. As you said, Lord Melbourne, the country is united in its love and compassion for its queen. It will not be easy but not so difficult to convince public opinion that the grieving queen needs the love and comfort of a noble gentleman who has always loved her and now comes to rescue her from her suffering and offer her the balm of her love. People love a good love story, Leopold said with some cynicism. But the Privy Council and Parliament would never approve of it, Lord Melbourne argued. Yes, they will, Lord Melbourne. Because the Conservative Party would close ranks to support the marriage, Leopold replied confidently. Did you speak first to the Duke of Wellington and Robert Peel? Asked Lord Melbourne bewildered. Yes, and they understood the need to save Victoria. Both are willing to do anything to prevent the Duke of Cumberland from being king, because they both know it would be a tragedy for England. Anyway, I do not deny that there was a certain reluctance, especially of Sir Robert, but in the end also accepted. They pledged themselves to get the Tory party to support your marriage. Of course that would be better for Sir Robert it to do as Prime Minister, Leopold said quietly. Of course, but the support of the Conservative Party is not decisive in the Privy Council, Lord Melbourne told him. But it is the support of the Duke of Wellington, perhaps the most influential member of the Privy Council. But we also have the support of the Duke of Sussex, as much or more influential than the Duke of Wellington, Leopold said with a slight smile. I see that you have solved everything, Your Majesty, Lord Melbourne replied with irony and a cynical expression on his face. Never underestimate your ability, for you have one's own way, Your Majesty. I'll take it as a compliment, Lord Melbourne, Leopold replied sarcastically. So all I have to do to save England from disaster is to agree to marry a woman expecting a child from another man, said Lord Melbourne with a hard expression on his face and a barely concealed scorn. Leopold became livid with anger. Lord Melbourne, I remind you that this woman is the Queen of England, your Queen, and my niece, exclaimed Leopold indignantly. Tell me one thing, Your Majesty. In your negotiations it has been established that the children of that eventual marriage would be entitled to succession to the crown, right? Asked Lord Melbourne coolly. What? Of course, it would not make sense if the children of Victoria could not inherit the crown from their mother, Leopold replied somewhat bewildered. And in that way the child who Victoria waits could, eventually inherit the crown. So your nephew Albert's child will probably sit on the British throne, and at least in part your wishes will come true, Lord Melbourne said with a light ironic smile. Lord Melbourne, you think the only thing that motivates me is my own ambition and my desire to elevate my family, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. And I do not deny that to a large extent that is the reason for my actions, something that I am not ashamed of, but you are wrong, if you think that I'm not interested in the welfare of my niece. For me she is very important, after all she is the daughter of my sister. I wish my niece had a long and glorious reign, and she may be happy in her private life too. As you say, Albert's child might come to reign in Britain, or perhaps not, but even if it were so, in the eyes of the world that child would not be Saxe-Coburg, would be your child, the child of Lord Melbourne. Leopold said very seriously, but honestly. But not before my eyes, nor before yours, nor those of all who know the truth, replied Lord Melbourne. It's your decision, Lord Melbourne. If you want to repudiate the child because he is not his son, if you does want to reject the woman you loves for her dishonour, you are in your right. But if you can see beyond your pride and your pain, if you really wants to serve your queen and your country with the greatest service imaginable, if you wants to save Victoria from humiliation and dishonour, and Britain from an uncertain and dangerous destiny, you will make a sacrifice. If you're the kind of man I think you are, you'll do it. If you are not, forgive me for bothering you with a request you find intolerable, Leopold replied. Lord Melbourne had a gesture of infinite torment on his face, with a hard look in his eyes. I cannot give you an answer now. I need to think, Lord Melbourne answered. I understand, but the answer cannot take long. If you accept, we must expedite the process and us ensure that the wedding is as soon as possible. Before the condition of my niece is very evident, replied Leopold. I'll try to answer it tomorrow, Lord Melbourne said in a broken voice. All right. See you soon, Lord Melbourne, Leopold said. I'll see you soon, Your Majesty, said Lord Melbourne with cool courtesy. Leopold went out into the hall and a servant accompanied him to the door. Lord Melbourne stood alone in the library, pacing impatiently from side to side, and in a rapture he grabbed a bottle of whiskey that was on a small table and threw it against a wall, bursting it into pieces. Then he slammed his fist several times on another wall, and finally sank his face against the wall, and cried. I invite you all to join the Facebook group, For the Love of Vikborn, a fan community of Vikborn where you can talk about your favorite subject in a very pleasant atmosphere.